to be partnered with NJDEP, Resilience New Jersey, and you'll hear from them this evening. And tonight's subtopic is sort of local resilience, infrastructure, and governance. So thank you for being here. As you heard, we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be available to everybody. Usually takes us a day or two to get it out to you, but you'll get an email with the recording link, and any other resources that we have, you'll get those in a link too. If you could put your questions in the Q&A for the speakers, we're going to wait till the end of the evening, so about 45 minutes or so from now, before we answer the questions. If you could put them in the Q&A, our speakers are going to actually ask for some input from you, and those answers we'd like you to put in the chat. You should be able to find those things in the bottom of your screen. And if we don't get to your questions tonight for some reason, you can always email us at info@anjec.org. And again, as you see, the recording will be on our YouTube page, as well as a link on our website. Here's a review. Many of you have been here with us before and have seen ANJEC's mission, adopted by our Board of Trustees and supported by the staff. If you have any questions on that, we'd love to chat. A lot of our big goals for ANJEC are education to empower EC action. We have a staffed resource center, a lot of digital tools, obviously, at this point. We offer many webinars throughout the year. We also publish the quarterly ANJEC report, and we have a bi-weekly digital newsletter called the ANJEC News. Coming up in March is our annual Fundamentals for Environmental Commissions. This is sort of a basic training for ECs. It's offered each spring. There will be some sessions in March, and then an in-person session later in the spring. And the other one of our signature events that we have annually is the Environmental Congress, which is in the fall. It's an in-person event. More info on that soon. Tomorrow at noon, there's an hour of action regarding Wharton State Forest and the new mapping that's going on there. And we'd love you to come and participate. And on January 28th, so 2 weeks from tonight, is part 2 of this climate change webinar with DEP, and that one's community engagement and risk communication. Again, that's 2 weeks from today, January 28th at 7. And then March, we have 3 days of digital training for the effective environmental commissions, and we'll soon be able to tell you when we're going to have the in-person, probably be in May sometime. Today's presenters, we're delighted to have Nick Angerone here with us. He's the Chief Resilience Officer and Manager for NJDEP's Office of Climate Resilience. Is Nick on with us? Did I see him? No, you didn't find him?
Yes, he's on.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you. Thank you. Nicholas Mitch is a resilience planner with Arcadis Climate Adaptation and Resilience Planning. Thank you, Nikki, for being here. And Elizabeth Mitchell, a resilience planner, Arcadis Climate Adaptation and Resilience Planning as well. And then we're lucky to have Ann Sues. She's the chair of the Princeton Environmental Commission, also joining us tonight. And I think we can just, I have little bios of you guys, or do you want to just introduce yourselves as you go, you speak? Elizabeth?
Let's introduce ourselves as we speak. Yeah, thanks.
Great, terrific. So if you have not yet joined your ANJEC membership, your municipal memberships are annual. They start in January. If you haven't received your forms or you need help with us, can you just let us know? You can find those. This QR code will take you to the link on our website. You can always email us at info@anjec.org. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind you that ANJEC is a private 501c3, and as such, we rely on personal and private donations from people like you. So thank you in advance for your support. And I think that's the end of mine. So I am delighted to now turn the screen over to Elizabeth Mitchell.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see my screen right now?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for joining this evening for our first webinar in the 2-part series. Tonight's topic is local resilience, infrastructure, and governance, and we're joined by NJDEP and are excited to discuss the Resilient New Jersey project in addition to some other content tonight. So we are the three webinar presenters. We'll have Nick Anderone, Nikki Mitch, and myself tonight. So excited to dive in and get started. Just as a brief introduction, tonight's webinar is about local resilience, infrastructure, and governance, and we're hoping tonight everyone leaves with an understanding of how environmental commissions, green teams, and other local institutions can be leaders in resilience and adaptation efforts in their communities. Hope everyone becomes familiar with potential adaptation actions and infrastructure actions, learn about potential governance actions, and get supported get connected to some resources that support action. And as Liz already plugged, we do have the second part in the webinar series in 2 weeks from today, which is on community engagement and risk communication. This is a brief agenda of what we're going to cover tonight. We'll start by diving into local institutions' role in resilience leadership, talk about resilience and infrastructure, and in the process, spotlight the Maplewood Stormwater Utility, then go into governance and spotlight Princeton's green building checklist, then highlight ANGEC's resource library, and finish up with time for questions. So the first part of this webinar is just getting us all on the same page. I think this audience is very familiar with climate change already, but it can't hurt to just do a little brief refresher at the beginning. So the first thing we need to consider is that climate change is not just coming anymore, it's already here. We're seeing that climate change is already affecting New Jersey, which is only going to intensify in the coming decades. So we're expecting to see a variety of climate impacts in the state, which include increased annual average temperatures. You can see the graph on the right side of the slide shows the historic average temperature change in New Jersey from 1895 to 2024. And this is showing that since that time, it has been approximately a 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit increase per decade, which is only going to increase in the future. New Jersey is also expected to experience increased annual precipitation and changes in the precipitation patterns that will result in more frequent droughts. So similarly, this graph is showing the trend from 1895 to 2024. And what it's showing is there's been about a 0.3-inch increase in precipitation per decade. And the last item we'd like to highlight is sunny day flooding and sea level rise, which will affect coastal regions of New Jersey. And what the map on the right is showing is a potential 2100 scenario where there's approximately 3.3 feet of sea level rise, which is about a 50% chance of happening according to the Rutgers sea level rise estimates. And although there are many more hazards that could occur under climate change future conditions, we'll be focusing on heat and flood resilience this evening. And now I am excited to be able to hand it over to Nick Anderone, who is New Jersey's Chief Resilience Officer and the manager of NJDEP's Office of Climate Resilience. Nick coordinates the statewide resilience policy and supports local governments in their efforts to address the impacts of climate change, among other statewide resilience work. So Nick, I will hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and I'm happy to be here. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk primarily about the Resilient NJ program and the work that my programs, the assistance my programs provide to local governments. But I want to just reference quickly that in my role as the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of New Jersey, I am Vice Chair of the Interagency Council on Climate Resilience. And that is presently made up of representatives from 26 state agencies and departments, all seeking to coordinate and move policy and action around climate resilience to address the increasing impacts of climate change. It's important, I think, for everybody to understand, or it's certainly important for me that you all understand, that we actually have a statewide climate change resilience strategy. That strategy lays out about 125 different priorities and actions that state agencies will take to promote and implement climate resilience throughout the state. It is a broad, high-level policy document, but is, in process, was adopted back in 2021, and we are in process of implementing that in many ways. One particular way has been a focus on extreme heat, and earlier, or it's 2025 now, in 2024, last year, we issued a extreme heat resilience action plan, which kind of went into more detail, one on the specific climate impact that we're all experiencing, but also the level of detail in the actions and commitments that you'll see from your state agencies. So it's important to understand that kind of resilience is happening in the state of New Jersey at all levels. But in my role as manager of the Office of Climate Resilience and DEP, we're very much focused on providing support to our communities in helping them understand and take action in response to those climate impacts. Right, and so at the local level, our flagship planning assistance program is Resilient NJ. And I'm sure, certainly hope, many of you are familiar with the program at this point, but I'll start with a quick overview of it nonetheless. Resilient NJ originated soon after Hurricane Sandy and focused on 4 multi-municipal, heavily impacted regions along the coast. Those regions have self-selected their names, but they are northeastern New Jersey, the Raritan River and Bay communities, Long Beach Island, and the Atlantic County coastal region. The Resilient NJ program pairs each region with a qualified consultant team who works collaboratively with them, and in this case, over the course of about 2 years, to develop a regional resilience action plan. Right. The process involved a forward-looking vulnerability and risk assessment, development of various resilience scenarios, robust community engagement, and envisioning to ensure that to develop the plans that are risk-informed, community-driven, and most importantly, actionable. Right? We don't want to develop plans just to sit on shelves. Right, so we have found this model to be hugely successful, and participating communities since the finalization of those plans have received over $25 million in additional federal investments to implement the actions that stemmed from the Resilient NJ plans. Right, I want to kind of pause there and make sure that people understand that. Right, we developed these comprehensive plans, and the consultant teams and the department continued to provide the support to implement the actions that were in there. And a lot of that implementation was applying for developing projects and grants for federal funding. And again, over $25 million has come in to support those regions because of this planning effort. So those 4 original Resilient NJ regions are now continuing to work with their consultant teams on an extension of the project, right, seeking again to implement actions from those action plans and continue to apply for federal opportunities and state funding opportunities to move the plans forward. With the success of the regional projects, we expanded Resilient NJ into kind of an umbrella program that now covers several initiatives, right? Both technical assistance as well as resource and guidance development. And we continue to run and enhance the regional program, and you should all be on the lookout. In 2025, we will launch opportunities for 4 to 6 new regional projects. Those will be announced on our website, resilient.nj.gov, when they're available. Right, but we also know that every municipality is at different places in kind of the planning process, as well as their understanding of risk, vulnerability, and resilience. And so in response, we launched the Municipal Assistance Program back in 2021, right, which provides resilience planning support for individual municipalities, right, in particular where they don't necessarily have the ability to or opportunity to work kind of in a more regional fashion. Similar to the regional program, we match those municipalities with pre-qualified consultant teams who work collaboratively to move resilience planning forward, however is most appropriate for each of those communities. Right, and as always, community engagement throughout that process is a high priority. So far, we've worked in 8 communities through the Municipal Assistance Program, and this year we will be launching a multi-municipal project with 11 municipalities in Burlington County along the Route 130 corridor. Of course, we know that the capacity to apply for technical assistance programs may not always be there, and our funding is unfortunately limited. So to that extent, we've developed multiple no-cost resources and guidance documents that municipalities can use to undertake resilience planning on their own. Again, all of which are available at resilient.nj.gov. This past November, we published an online climate resilience funding directory that allows anyone, right, whether it's municipalities, other state agencies, businesses, nonprofits, community-based organizations, academic organizations, to find information about key resilience-related funding. It is a searchable database, and it is updated regularly, right, as old funding opportunities close and new funding becomes available. The tool also includes success stories to help inspire new project ideas or understand how different funding opportunities can be leveraged for resilience. We also have a long-standing online resource, a local planning for climate change toolkit, which describes step-by-step how local officials can identify their areas of vulnerability and consider how they might want to address them. And within that toolkit are a lot of resources, worksheets and spreadsheets, guidance for local planners to use and help think through some of those planning questions that arise as they undertake their resilience planning efforts, right? And we'll continue to update and improve that toolkit to make it easier to use and ensure that it encompasses the most up-to-date practices and resources for resilience planning. Elizabeth, go ahead to the next slide. The 2021, the municipal land use law was amended, and this has been one of the biggest changes in our state's planning landscape in years. This amendment requires that all municipalities incorporate a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment, it is a mouthful, into your local master plan land use plan elements, right? This is a base level multi-hazard assessment, right? It looks at kind of flooding and temperature, sea level rise, and other vulnerabilities. And interestingly, also requires that local governments perform a build-out analysis and evaluate kind of the areas of not just existing growth that may be vulnerable to climate impacts, but future areas as well. The law, the amendment to the MLUL requires DEP to provide technical assistance as practicable. As you might imagine, we've incorporated the CCR HVA requirements into all aspects of Resilient NJ, both technical assistance programs and the online resources and guidance. New Jersey Future has also developed comprehensive guidance that includes step-by-step instructions and worksheets to help towns conduct a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment that meets the MLUL requirements. And that's the kind of the illustration, the photo there on that slide. So if done well, the CCR HVA can be a very powerful tool for towns, right? It's an important step in the planning process. Understand what your vulnerabilities are and who's impacted. It encourages proactive thinking and planning about climate change. And it should meaningfully inform important land use decisions like zoning and redevelopment, right? And this is very much in line with the principles and goals of the Resilient NJ program, in that informed communities make informed decisions. So with that, I will take a drink and hand it back to Elizabeth to go into more detail.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nick. And excited to hear you plug those resources, especially the toolkit, which we definitely relied heavily on to put this presentation together. So it's a great resource that we have linked here. I am going to go ahead and dive into the content now. So today's webinar is focusing on local institutions' role in resilience using the steps that you see in this diagram on the slide. So we wanted to emphasize that local leaders, including environmental commissioners, play a really important role in improving local resilience. So today we're going to discuss each of the steps highlighted here and review the ways that ECs can contribute to advancing each step. So the steps are initiating the process and engaging with the community, understanding the community's vulnerability, developing a strategy to address climate vulnerability, implementing the strategy, tracking your progress toward the actions you outlined. And you'll notice that the steps are cycles, so we think it's important to revisit the plans and update them as needed based on the changing community feedback and climate conditions. Additionally, you'll note that engagement is not a one-time activity in this cycle. It should happen throughout the planning process, so you can be sure that the plan reflects the community's needs and preferences. Community engagement should be the first step in these resilience efforts, and it should be this ongoing process throughout the project. Gaining community buy-in for resilience planning is an important part of building a project, and local leaders should get feedback from community members throughout the process to make sure the project aligns with the community's vision and is actually addressing the key needs that the community is identifying. Project leaders are people who are committed to representing the community's interests throughout the project. And it's also important to involve a core group of community members in a steering committee who can be involved in the day-to-day project operations, which can ensure there's like consistent engagement and feedback that is incorporated into the project. While a lot of people are really excited to participate in the resilience planning process, it's also really important to involve people who are part of underrepresented and vulnerable populations who may have been overlooked in past planning processes. These groups may have higher risk to climate change than other groups in the community, so planning for resilience with these groups in mind is critical. They may experience barriers to participation, so ensuring that engagement is accessible to these groups is key. Lastly, the advisory committees made up of stakeholders with special expertise can provide nuance to the project. So we've discussed the types of voices that are important to incorporate in the planning process, but also recognize that there are many barriers to participation that prevent people from being actively engaged in the planning process. We would like to invite you to share some ideas about the barriers that might prevent people from participating in resilience efforts and ways that there might be to overcome those barriers. So we'll take a minute here and see if people have some ideas to share in the chat. Can't see the chat right now, but I can start us off. One thing is language barriers. So making sure that you have materials available in multiple languages or having interpretation services that are available can be a huge asset in involving community members. I'm getting some other comments in the chat. Maybe Sheila or Nikki, are there things that people are commenting here?
Sure. Limited English skills, lack of transportation, childcare. Let's see, lack of engagement. There are time constraints, social media limitations. Oops, everything's moving around on me now. Lack of belief in climate change, unfamiliarity. Hold on a minute. With the community planning process. Awareness of opportunities of where they can participate. Awareness of opportunities. Meeting access in person versus remote, social media limitations, diversity. There are quite a few.
That's great. Thank you all for participating. So we'll talk about how to overcome some of those barriers today, but look forward to continuing the conversation throughout the planning process. The next step in this process is understanding the community's vulnerability. So project teams need to understand the community's natural hazard exposure to ensure that planning efforts are addressing critical needs. Performing a vulnerability assessment can identify the potential impacts of climate change And the vulnerability assessment process highlights climate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, so local leaders can understand the total impacts of climate change. Climate exposure refers to the way that climate change and intensifying hazards will affect communities. So some things to think about are what hazards are expected to affect communities most in the future, which parts of the community will be most exposed. Sensitivity refers to the degree to which communities will be harmed by climate change. So what could happen if the community was exposed to a natural hazard? Adaptive capacity is the community's ability to mitigate harm. So you can think, are people able to make their homes more resilient? Do people know how to respond to climate hazard events? And then lastly, vulnerability is the combined exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity in each community. And it's the extent to which communities are prone to or unable to cope with the impacts of climate change. So there are many free online tools that can help communities identify vulnerability. And the tools highlighted on this slide can help communities understand their vulnerability. For example, the NOAA Sea Level Rise Calculator and NJ Adapt. And these tools also can highlight parts of the community that will be particularly susceptible to climate hazards and face barriers to responding to hazards, like the NJ Environmental Justice Mapping Tool and the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. So though these tools can be helpful, community members also provide important feedback in identifying vulnerability. People's lived experiences with hazards can highlight parts of the community that are vulnerable to climate impacts, but may not stand out in an online tool. This is just one extra reason why community engagement is such a critical part of the resilience planning process. In addition to things that are identified by community members during engagement, local leaders can identify community assets that fall into multiple buckets that are important to consider in the vulnerability assessment process. The buckets listed on the slide encompass both straightforward assets like infrastructure and emergency response, but also ones that might be a little bit less clear-cut, like ecosystem health and quality of life. We've highlighted this on the slide, but environmental commissions play a key role of bringing to light the assets that may be overlooked in the vulnerability assessment process. Existing projects and plans like Resilient NJ plans that are ongoing might have already assessed assets and compiled a list of critical ones in your community. So it's important to review the local and regional plans to see what work has been done so far. Once you have a list of critical assets in the buckets that are informed by the input that you've gathered and the existing plans, local leaders can build a vulnerability matrix that considers exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and can highlight the assets that are especially vulnerable to climate change. Because we know everyone has constraints on the time and effort that they can put into a vulnerability assessment, a vulnerability matrix can help you prioritize assets that should be the focus of planning efforts. Different communities have different critical assets. So we invite you to brainstorm some of the assets that would be really important to include in your community's vulnerability matrix. So once you understand your community's vulnerability, local leaders can build a strategy that addresses vulnerability and starts to improve resilience. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy to build resilience, but there are some questions that can guide the development of a strategy. You can think about what would happen in your community if resilience planning tools were not implemented, and what actions might prevent negative outcomes from actually happening that could result from hazard exposure. The list of actions you consider should build resilience for critical assets identified in the vulnerability assessment for the hazards that you flagged as especially prevalent in the future, whether that's flooding or extreme heat or something else. There are a wide variety of strategies that can improve resilience. So some examples here include physical and nature-based solutions, governance change, and emergency response and preparedness. Environmental commissions play an important role in improving government transparency by sharing information about resilience efforts in the community and how community members can participate in the process. ECs should also listen to community input and advocate for the solutions that community members prefer to help make the resulting resilience strategy reflective of the community's preferences. Once local leaders in the community have settled on a preferred resilience solution, it's time to implement the project. It's very important to consider who should be involved in the implementation process, and potential participants can include local government officials who are spearheading the process and find funding for projects, engineers and construction workers who are in charge of implementing and installing the infrastructure itself, community leaders who share project information with the community, and the actual community members themselves who stay engaged and continue to give feedback about the project. Environmental commissions can participate in this process by sharing funding sources with local government leaders, advocating for a preferred solution, and sharing implementation information with the community. Local leaders play an important role in the implementation process by identifying funding sources for projects and implementing the highest priority actions. There are federal, state, and local funding sources that can help with the project implementation process. And as Nick mentioned earlier, there are online resources that have already compiled a list of funding sources for resilience. So this is one example of the New Jersey Mitigation Resource Guide, which includes federal funding assistance and other hazard mitigation resources and is available for free online. NJDEP also has this new climate resilience funding directory, which Nick mentioned earlier. It's a searchable list of funds that are categorized by resilience activity. The last step in this process is tracking progress after implementation. So it's important to revisit your plans and projects over time to make them living documents that adapt to changing climate conditions and community preferences. So I'm now going to hand it over to Nikki, who is going to discuss a case study, the Resilient NJ RRBC Action Plan.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth said, I'm a resilience planner at Arcadis, based out of New York City. I've been really excited to be engaged on the variety of resilient NJ projects that we've worked on in the past few years. And currently, I'm actually coordinating the RRBC area, which stands for the Raritan River and Bay Communities. That's one of two regions that we're working on projects in right now. So that region encompasses the 7 coastal communities of Middlesex County. Some of you may be from some of those. I think I saw someone from South River. So really excited to have you here. It also includes Carteret, Old Bridge, Perth Amboy, Saraville, South Amboy, and Woodbridge. And just wanted to share this as kind of an example of what this planning process can look like. So, maybe, this is something that as you hear about the approach we took to one form or another in one scale or another, it's something that you can take back and take to your communities. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. But just going to kind of walk through this timeline to share how we began to understand risk and then put it into action. And first off, we worked to really analyze climate hazards in this region. The project actually started looking pretty exclusively, I should mention, started back in 2021, looking pretty exclusively at flooding. And then as we talked to folks and looked at the risk on the ground, it became clear that there was an interest and need to address other climate issues as well. And we're excited that the state was really excited about that too. And we expanded to consider things like extreme heat, air pollution, and related issues. So once we analyzed those climate risks in the context of the available data that we had, and because of the funding of this program, we were able to do some additional flood modeling, but there's really a wealth of available modeling there that your community can get started with, even if you don't have the team of flood modelers that Arcadis has. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Once we had done that analysis of climate risks, we sought to kind of identify what strategies could address those specific risks that were being felt in these specific communities. And with those strategies, we could go ahead and go to the next slide. We got community feedback, heard community's vision and priorities for what they wanted the future of their community to look like, and began to really synthesize that feedback and develop a variety of scenarios for how we could address climate risk. And we can go to the next slide. So as we develop those scenarios, we continue to get iterative feedback And that all turned into the action plan. The action plan included a whole host of recommendations across 3 different action areas. Those were policy and governance, physical and nature-based infrastructure, and then community education and outreach. And I think, a great example of that community education outreach is actually this webinar that we're doing today, kind of very much seeing the resilience and, that, I guess, as Elizabeth said, the engagement phase of all of this doesn't just happen as we're putting the plan together, it really continues to happen as we implement the plan. And so we've been in this implementation phase of the action plan for over a year now, and have been really working with the municipalities in this region, as Nick mentioned, to continue to seek funding and really find ways to actually turn this plan from something that's pretty and sitting on a shelf to actual impact in these communities. And I think we've been really excited to see that happen. Believe that I'll turn it back over to you, Elizabeth, unless I am mistaken.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Nikki. So we'll spend the next part of this webinar talking about some of the specific types of resilience actions that communities can implement, and that could be some of the ones that are overlapping with the Resilient NJ RRBC action plan, but there are other ways that ECs and local governments can improve resilience. So the first on our list is resilience infrastructure, which can protect and improve key infrastructure assets. Resilience infrastructure can encompass green and gray solutions that protect assets and can also provide amenities in the process. Environmental commissions can participate in the infrastructure project selection process by advocating for solutions that align with environmental goals, such as increased green infrastructure, wetlands protection, and wildlife habitat preservation. Gray infrastructure projects could include shoreline barriers to protect low-lying areas where coastal flooding is an issue, improved stormwater system capacity to address stormwater flooding, and building and site scale adaptation of critical infrastructure such as floodproofing. Green infrastructure projects, on the other hand, could include the restoration of riparian zones or tidal wetlands and relocating vulnerable uses to minimize exposure, allowing plant growth to reduce flood exposure in the process. Environmental commissions play a critical role in advancing resilient infrastructure projects. Commissions can encourage local communities to work on resilience projects by advocating for resilience plan development and project implementation. They can inform their communities about vulnerability and hazards that may affect the community in the future. They can share details about projects in the community and describe ways that the community members can get involved. And they can propose adaptation actions that can improve resilience to local planners and other government officials. So we'll pause here for a moment and feel free to share in the chat other ways that ECs can advance resilient infrastructure projects. Gotten anyone? Is anyone sharing information in the chat, Sheila?
Sorry, no, I'm not seeing anything yet.
No, that's fine. Well, we can move on, but feel free to put stuff in the chat if things come to mind in the following slides. I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Sheila to discuss our local institution spotlight, which is the Maplewood Stormwater Utility.
Thank you. And this actually will kind of respond to, there was a question about how do you even get the funding to start? In October, some of you may have been at our webinar entitled Unlocking Sustainable Solutions, How Stormwater Utilities Can Fund the Future of Stormwater Management. And in that webinar, we had Vic DeLuca, who's a Maplewood committee person, and he presented to our ECs about the steps that Maplewood took to pursue a stormwater utility. Which is a way of funding these kind of projects. It's an equitable way, and it's a dedicated funding source. So it can't be used for other projects. It can only be used for stormwater management. So I actually lived in Maplewood from 1998 until 2022, and I was on the Environmental Advisory Committee. And among our members was the town engineer, who was also the head of the Department of Public Works. And before I left, I recall him expressing an interest in pursuing stormwater utilities as a way to fund water infrastructure projects. They'll be using it for big ticket projects, not for regular maintenance and repair. But there were a lot of big ticket projects that they wanted to get to that they did not have the funds for. In December, the Township Committee passed a stormwater utility. They passed their ordinance. They're presently in the process of amending it, but only because they wanted to extend the time frame for people to appeal their fee. And one thing that really stuck with me from Vic's presentation was he said that when the ability to have a stormwater utility first came about in 2019 with the enabling legislation, they didn't really have the appetite for pursuing it. There were talk about the rain tax and things like that, and they just thought that it wasn't the right time for them. Until Hurricane Ida. So during Hurricane Ida, they lost a resident who was out trying to clear a storm drain. And Vic said that once that happened, it completely changed their view of it, since it was a safety issue and a life and death issue. So it really changed the way they looked at pursuing that, because they had these projects, they want to get them done. They don't want to keep kicking the can down the road. And they want their residents to be safe. So kudos to Maplewood on that front. And we look forward to hearing how that all rolls out for them.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sheila.
Sure.
So in addition to infrastructure improvements, governance can also improve resilience. Policy changes like resilience requirements for new developments can make communities more resilient over time, as can things like zoning changes, local ordinances, economic development, and redevelopment. So these changes don't only promote infrastructure resilience, but they also advance resilience in other facets of the community, like the economy. Specific policy changes can include changes in industrial land uses, facilitating growth outside the floodplain, making transportation systems more resilient to flooding, and having higher standards for stormwater management and floodplain ordinances. Environmental commissions play a critical role in advancing resilient policy. Commissions can advise local governments on potential policies and policy enhancements that improve resilience. They can assess the existing policy landscape in the community to determine where gaps may exist. They can research policies that have been successfully implemented in other communities to better understand the implementation process and outcomes. And they can participate in the site plan review process and ensure alignment with policies focused on resilience. So again, feel free to chime in the chat and share ways that ECs can promote resilience policy. But while you're thinking, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Anne, who is the chair of the Princeton Environmental Commission, to talk about an exciting new resilience policy program.
Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm Anne Schoch, chair of the Princeton Environmental Commission, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we revised our green development or green building checklist, which is an important tool for the Environmental Commission as we evaluate developments. Princeton's original green development checklist was ordinanced all the way back in 2013. And at that time, we followed a template that was suggested by Sustainable Jersey. Each item in the checklist had several subsections, and it was easy for developers to equivocate about what they would or would not do because the items were not focused on just one concern at a time. Last spring, we had to try and summarize responses to our checklist for the past several years for Sustainable Jersey recertification. And we found the process was slow, laborious, and not really very data-driven. So we spent some time researching green development checklists from around New Jersey, and we decided to do a complete revision. Next slide. So 3 members of the Environmental Commission worked closely with our planning department members to try and put together a more concise checklist with questions framed in such a way that developers would have to answer yes or no, and then explain their answers. We had hoped to have this checklist online as a fillable form so that we could download it and use a spreadsheet to sort the results. So far, that hasn't happened, but the new ordinance was only passed late last year, and we've only had 2 developers who have filled out the checklist so far. Now, in addition to the checklist, a writing team of 3 Environmental Commission members produced 2 documents, one fairly short and one very lengthy, explaining why and how each item on the checklist was important. And in the longer document, giving numerous links for those who are interested to follow up on. These are going to be distributed to the planning board at their organizational meeting in January. Both of these documents passed the Environmental Commission and also the Planning Department. And both of these documents are also posted on the Environmental Commission website at princetonnewjersey.gov. Next slide. So far, only 2 developments we've reviewed have used the new checklist. The first development treated it like the old checklist, and the planning board was really pretty unhappy with their responses. The second has yet to be reviewed, but this is a snapshot of a few of their answers. These people were much more direct in whether they would or not do something, and in most cases, they explained why, not in all of them, as you can see. We're waiting to hear if it's legal for the planning board to require developers to answer all the questions on the checklist or not. We think that that's probably not legally required, but it would be great if it were. So that's how we revised the checklist. We started probably in March or April of last year, and we got ordinanced and it got into effect right at the end of 2024. So we are very happy that we kind of met our own goals. Now, I do have a question for everyone who's listening. Do any of the municipalities that you represent use any tools like this checklist to reward developers who agree to implement sustainable practices? In other words, can you give developers carrots if they do sustainable things? We'd like to know if any communities do that. I would love to get in touch with you if you do. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne, and we look forward to seeing people's responses in the chat. So before I wrap up, I wanted to highlight the ANGEC Resource Library. The resources and tools page on the website is a really, really great resource, and it includes information about land use initiatives, climate change impacts, and environmental justice. So if you're not already familiar, I would definitely encourage you to check it out. And thank you all so much for tuning in today. Just to wrap up, local leaders play a critical role in promoting resilience and helping communities respond to climate change. Environmental commissions are a really important piece of the puzzle and can take steps to promote resilience using the steps we've highlighted today. We have a little bit of time left, so invite you to ask any questions or share information about resilience in your community.
Yeah, and I know we had a few questions in the chat already, so I don't know if Sheila and Liz, if you had ideas of where we might want to start, or
Yes, we have some that were answered, but if we in order to get them to be part of this recording, I would like to rephrase them. There's a question here: is the Sustainable Jersey Climate Vulnerability Assessment Technical Assistance consistent with the resilience planning strategy developed by RNJ? And Nick had answered that the Sustainable Jersey, New Jersey Future Guidance document is focused on development of a climate change-related hazard vulnerability assessment required by the MLUL, by the Municipal Land Use Law. The CCRHVA is not as detailed as the methodology implemented through the Resilient NJ projects, but is also much less resource intensive. So thank you for that answer. We have another question. Let's see, is it the same one? That's the same one. Now, is the vulnerability assessment required to be done, or only required if there is an amendment to the land use element of the master plan after 2021? If, i.e. if no amendment there is no requirement to do the vulnerability assessment. And Nick, I don't know if you want to re-answer these, or I could just go ahead and read your responses.
I can re-answer it. It's fine. So the amendment to the MLUL that required the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessments said that applied to any land use plan element that was adopted after February 4th, 2021. Right. The kind of loophole there, though, is if you aren't updating your land use plan element, you're technically not required to, perform that CCR HVA. So yes, the questioner is technically correct. That said, we see a lot of municipalities that are undergoing that process, whether they're updating their land use plan element or not.
All right, and then thank you for that. And then we have another question. When will DEP provide a shape file with the most up-to-date new floodplain?
So I think, right, people should understand first that the floodplains that you're probably most familiar with, right, are those that are produced by FEMA, the quote unquote 100-year and 500-year floodplains. And we should all understand first that those were developed to determine who needed flood insurance, right? They do not include considerations of climate change, nor do they include or recognize the development of that has happened throughout the watershed. So DEP in forget which year is which anymore, but in the last few years, right, post Ida, we updated our inland flood protection rules, right? So our Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, stormwater rules, and the like, based on both our experience with Ida, but also scientific reports projecting out increases in precipitation events through the end of the century. And so the update to our inland flood rules is effectively, to keep it simple, is kind of that FEMA 100-year floodplain, the 1% flood, plus 3 feet, right? So we think about that as it kind of goes up vertically and then horizontally. Similarly, the NJPACT real rules, right, just again to kind of oversimplify a bit, are more coastal focused, right? Look at that FEMA 1% chance annual flood, the 100-year flood, plus 5 feet of sea level rise, right? And that layer is called the tidal climate adjusted flood elevation. All of that mapping is available on the njfloodmapper.org website, which is run by Rutgers. There is no official updated floodplain mapping.
All right, thank you. We have another question. Are there any new concerns for New Jersey communities with large park areas that may be more susceptible to wildfires going forward, particularly seeing the devastating wildfires on the West Coast? Is there evidence that droughts and high winds seem to be increasing in recent years?
So I gave a couple of responses to that question. So first, for kind of wildfire, forest fire concerns, you should take a look at the New Jersey Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. In particular, there's a Wildfire Risk Explorer that'll provide you some understanding of kind of your risk for your area. There's also a fire danger dashboard that'll give you more updated information on kind of what's happening around wildfire right now. And I forgot to put the link to that in the chat in the response, but that is New Jersey, spell out the words, NewJerseyWildfireRisk.com. All of the most current New Jersey specific climate science can be found at the link that I provided there, but it is, if you just do a search for New Jersey climate change science, it'll bring you to this page. And in particular, there is a tool, a resource on there Climate Change in New Jersey Impacts and Effects, which is meant to kind of present the science to you in a more friendly way. Information about drought in New Jersey can be found at dep.nj.gov/drought. Yes, drought is increasing. Intensity and length of drought is something that is a potential impact of climate change. It's also something, while technically not drought, kind of drier periods of time in between more intense precipitation events is also what we expect to see. I'm not familiar off the top of my head with anything about increasing winds not associated with tropical cyclones.
Thanks, Nick. That's very helpful. Matthew, there's a question that's in the chat that I thought people might want to hear your answers. CCR HVA requires us to use the latest scientific forecast, for example, sea level rise, but there is debate on where the correct forecast to use. Do you have the best ideas on guidance on suitable scientific data?
Again, for New Jersey specific information, go to the climate change, DEP's climate change website. You can look at, if you want to argue with kind of with the scientists, like, go nuts. That's not, I'm not the guy for that conversation. And I'll note in particular with sea level rise, we have New Jersey and precipitation. We have New Jersey specific projections, right? These are not national, not NOAA, not international projections. These are New Jersey specific. And so we will argue that they are much better to use than kind of national projections.
And they're pretty updated too, as we all know. The guy's been working
Right.
hard to get those really nice and current. So yeah, that's where you want to go, guys, everybody. Anything else, Sheila, that you think we need to read? I haven't seen any nuke ones pop up that you think.
Well, sure. Does the code used in New Jersey require a local level environmental commission to review construction proposals, or is this determined by local ordinance and structures? So I don't know if you want to jump in, Liz. I would say that, I mean, it does depend on the municipalities, but if you are established by ordinance and then you have the right to review these development plans, but that is as far as it goes. There's no teeth in that one that I know
That's
of.
correct.
Not
It
yet.
definitely helps. It has a little more of a tooth, if you will, if you have your ERI, your environmental resource inventory on file. The law mentions that. So,
Right.
but we know ECs whose ERI may be out of date or never done, and they still get to see the plans. You got to make friends with your municipality is really the answer.
Right.
So we're happy to help. Anja can help you try to negotiate some of that if you can't. So feel free, send us an email.
Yes. So here's another question. Are there any climate resilient initiatives in Northwest Jersey? The mindset is that without a shore, there is no reason to make extra work for the municipality. I think
So,
Go ahead.
the answer certainly from a New Jersey specific, or as a New Jersey funded planning process, we don't have anything, I'd say, at least in the way I would define Northwest New Jersey. Most of the funding that we have in New Jersey to do climate resilience stems from federal disasters, right? So in recent years, largely that's Sandy and Ida. Right, so most of the work that we've talked about today largely stemmed from federal disaster funding from Hurricane Sandy. There is some of the, I mentioned opportunities for some of the regional planning efforts that will be announced this year that is utilizing funding from federal disaster funding post Ida. So Northwest New Jersey will be eligible. Those communities will be eligible to apply for that support. But again, like the Sandy specific funding was limited to the coast. what I'd say about if there's no coast, you don't need to do the work. And what I'll say is if it rains where you live, it can flood where you live. And so, right, if you have water bodies, right, we saw in Warren County, I forget it was last year before, right, we had a significant precipitation event, which resulted in landslides. So all of these are issues that in any part of the state that, you know, we can bring kind of technical expertise and assistance to help you decide how you want to respond to these increasing impacts from climate change.
All right, so we have one more. With the incoming administration on the national level, there are climate deniers. So how does our state combat that kind of thinking and stave off any potential impact to our plans?
Well, what I will say is that, right, these conversations and groups like ANJEC and interested parties like everyone here are how we ensure that the work continues regardless of what happens at the federal level, right? There's the potential that you know, they change the rules and they kind of got the funding that is kind of funded a lot of this the work over the last few years, and New Jersey's going to have to, sorry to be you know, for a pun here, but New Jersey's going to have to adapt to that, right? We are one of the few states on the East Coast that doesn't have its own permanent stable funding source for climate resilience activities. And so, right, if the federal funding goes away, we're going to have to figure out how we fund our communities to take these actions.
Thank you. That's helpful. Never give up, everybody. Don't worry. We got all these guys working, helping us.
Yeah, everybody working at their local level and their municipalities, keep moving it forward.
And I'll add there that, like, your elected officials at every level, right? Your local, your county, your state legislators, the governor, right? They want to hear from you. You're like, they don't want to hear from me, right, about the kind of these issues, but they want to hear from you. And if these are the issues that you feel are important, you should let them know, and, you know, advocate for what you think are the requirements, or they should be doing to support these efforts.
All right, is there anything else in the chat, Liz, that you wanted to address?
I think there was a question about like how communities can have funding to get started, and you know, just kind of how daunting it can be, which I definitely know is the case. And so I think I and Megan can maybe add a few thoughts to get started there, and then I don't know if other folks have ideas. But you know, I think there are a lot of grants out there, but even applying for those grants can be really daunting and challenging. That's definitely something we're very aware of. So I think one of the best ways to get started is to try to incorporate resilience and associated efforts into current, like ongoing planning efforts in your community. So that could be like your master planning processes or your hazard mitigation planning, or similar processes, just things that are already funded, already happening in your community, and just seizing that as an opportunity to have conversations about resilience. That can be a really great way to get started. And then Megan, I don't know if you want to add anything about the idea of catalyst projects and how that can kind of be an opportunity to get started as well.
Yeah, just we've found a lot of success in if a community can find one project that gets a lot of support and buy-in and momentum and enthusiasm, that, you know, and finding the right funding for that, whether it's through county sources and you know, there are state sources that we've seen used for resilience, like Green Acres funding. So finding a catalyst project that can really demonstrate the value and that can really be used as a starting point for future implementation projects.
Yeah, terrific. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers, Elizabeth, Nick, Ann, Nikki, and Megan. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. It really was a lot of information, and I know we'll be hearing from our members and all that. We will be sharing resources and links with everybody that was registered. So look for an email from Anjak in the next couple of days, and we will hopefully see many of you in 2 weeks for session 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.